Welcome to History Comes Alive, the podcast that takes you on a deep dive into a new historical topic every episode. Join us as we explore the nuances of historical events you probably didn't learn about in school. Here's your host, Jeff Nichols.
Welcome back. Glad you could make it. We have a great episode planned. It's part 2 of probably a trilogy developing the activities and the contributions of the Wampanoag Sachem, or chief, Massasoit, in regards to the Pilgrims. His help was instrumental in their ability to survive. And you could argue that his help really helped to establish all the New England colonies. And we ended last time just as he came on the scene. You recall his visit to Plymouth was preceded by Samoset's visit. He was a visiting native from Maine, and he knew English, and he helped to facilitate trade and good relations between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoags. These were a regional power that included many smaller tribes. Their numbers had been hit hard by the plague and disease of the previous 5 years. Now, at the time of Samoset's visit, the Pilgrims had had a tough go so far. Ever since the Battle of First Encounters the previous December, where Miles Standish proved his worth and earned his keep in the midst of an attack by the hostile, anti-English Nauset tribe of Cape Cod. Massasoit, or Osamequin, as he is sometimes referred to in the history books, his sudden appearance had caught the Pilgrims off guard. He arrived unannounced with 60 warriors. At the time, there probably weren't even 60 Pilgrims left. It was a precarious position they found themselves in, but one that quickly turned in their favor. It became an advantageous meeting for decades to come. Now, I've titled this episode Massasoit Part 2, The Treaty of 1621 and Its Fallout. And in this episode, we want to continue to develop the narrative of how the relationship was forged and how it developed. The other tribes in the area were not so happy about the agreement that was made. And there were a lot of tribes to consider. The Nausets were obviously not happy, but there was the Massachusetts, they weren't happy, and the greatest threat to the Wampanoags, the Narragansetts of modern-day Rhode Island, they weren't happy either. And their goal was to subjugate the Wampanoags. Good relations with the Pilgrims added numbers and firepower to Massasoit's arsenal. There was even discord within the Wampanoag alliance, and we'll cover several events that introduce these other tribes and factions that will help to fill out the relationship. We'll see that the real strength of Massasoit was diplomacy and knowing when to exercise restraint and when to exercise power. He was a shrewd man navigating very hostile, turbulent times. There's 2 things in this episode I want to kind of think about in terms of the Treaty of 1621 these 2 groups were about to enter into and its aftermath. The first thing is how the various tribes in the region eventually came to terms with the Pilgrims because of Massasoit's determination. And that includes the Nausets, the Massachusetts, and even the powerful Narragansetts backed off. And years later, they would fight the Wampanoags again, but their main issue right now with Plymouth was the treaty itself. They would prove to be great friends to Roger Williams just a few years later, and even an ally of the Puritans against everybody's enemy, the feared and dreaded regional dominators, the Pequots. And 2, how the treaty itself was worked out on not only a political alliance, but an actual friendship developed between the Pilgrims and Massasoit himself, if not the rest of the Wampanoags. So we left off last time reading a contemporary description of Massasoit. On one hand, it's vague, but on the other hand, it's very telling. And I wanted to read this again and then kind of peel through this a little bit. So Massasoit was portrayed this way: a very lusty man in his best years, an able body, grave of countenance, spare of speech, in his attire, little or nothing differing from the rest of his followers. Only a great chain of white bone beads about his neck, and at it behind his neck hangs a little bag of tobacco, which he drank and gave to us. His face was painted with a sad, deep red like Murray or mulberry, and oiled both head and face, and he looked greasily. And one more thing, a great long knife hung on a string at his breast was his only weapon. Let's think about that description a little bit. When we meet Massasoit, who lived from 1581 to 1661, that's a long time, he's about 40, so he's still youngish. And the description from those that were there said that he was sturdy and he's serious. The times and first encounter would probably have called for that. And he's not an idle chit-chatter. I mean, to me, that indicates confidence. He was not just nervously chit-chatting away with the pilgrims. And from the description, I also get a sense that he was close to his men. He identified with them, and they probably identified with him. He dressed like them. There's nothing very distinguishing about him on this initial visit. And I want to be careful with that thought because the records show that the native chiefs from Powhatan and the Chesapeake to the northern natives like Massasoit could be very much into pomp and circumstance, very much into pageantry when they were entertaining guests, just like their European counterparts. And I think that might be a subject that we tackle at some point as kind of a bonus episode or just include that in the narrative at some point because we're going to meet a lot of native leaders. But anyway, Massasoit's attire was not fancy, except for the face paint and the oil. And he had that little tobacco pouch and white bone bead necklace. That's what set him apart. Even the knife across his chest suggests a comfort and a confidence. He didn't have any other weapons with him personally. That would be intimidating for sure. So as a reminder, our goal for this larger series, because this is where the rubber really starts to meet the road, right through the American Revolution is twofold. The first one is colonial unity. And that's a big deal because even in New England, we're going to find that they competed, that there was disunity oftentimes. And secondly, the intentional actions of the native tribes. You remember I read that quote from one guy. It's a decent book on the French and Indian War. And I know it's a little out of context here. We're over a century off. But what was written could be conveyed for virtually any of the time frames or regions that we're going to be looking at. And it said this, quote, "Many Indian tribes became involved, but their viewpoints were limited and confused. They were anxious to be on the winning side," end quote. The first thing is that's kind of silly. I mean, everybody was, everybody is, everybody will always be vying to be on the winning side, right? So what? But the thing that struck me about that quote as I was preparing for the podcast last year is that blanket label, again, even if this is in the French and Indian war times, it could easily be traced back to here, that the Indian tribes were limited and confused. I mean, that's a stereotype. It's easily disproven. Starting here as we develop the history, and the plan is to develop the history right through the French and Indian War until we win the revolution and codify the governmental system that we still live under today. We'll see the world that they lived in was tough and dynamic. It was not static. That they were not limited or confused in their viewpoints. They were calculating and vying for supremacy. Sometimes they were just vying for survival, like everybody else around them. The Europeans had superior numbers and technology and a more unified approach. The natives were in a constant state of national emergency. I mean, how would anybody act in these times? So again, starting with Massasoit, we'll begin to develop a narrative that demonstrates diplomacy and vision, strength and humility, tenacity and courage in so many of the native leaders. And like I said, one of the goals of this episode, the primary goal, is to work through some of the immediate fallout of Massasoit's treaty with Plymouth. Officially, it's the Treaty of 1621. Its main benefactors were the Pilgrims and Massasoit. I mean, the Wampanoags benefited, but I think that their leader was the biggest winner above and beyond the tribe. Make no mistake, as we'll see, this treaty impacted everybody. And then I want to end our time working through another specific episode that helps to illustrate the intimate, personal nature of the friendship that developed between Massasoit and the Pilgrims. I mean, they saved his life, not in battle, but in illness. And that will help us to understand next week's episode, because it was at the healing of Massasoit that our next big event, and it will be significant, begins to take root. So the negotiations, the relationship began between the Wampanoags and the Pilgrims. It was an official agreement of peace and mutual support, and it was agreed upon by Governor John Carver of Plymouth and the sake of Massasoit directly. It was a legal document, a political gamble that offered both parties reward, but the road to trust would be long and windy at times. Nobody there that day was ignorant of the Pilgrims' shortcomings, but nobody was ignorant of Massasoit's concerns over conflict with the Narragansetts, nor his struggles with some of the other regional tribes. The Pilgrims were vulnerable in many ways, but they did have guns, superior firepower, which was potentially helpful to the Wampanoags. And both of these groups needed each other, and despite many challenges, both sides pretty much throughout Massasoit's long life kept their side of the bargain. That in and of itself is impressive, especially for those times. I mean, Massasoit lived until 1661. That was going to be a 40-year friendship. It really was a treaty of timeliness and personal attention by Massasoit. And once he passes from the scene, things will get trickier. But there's quite a ways away yet in our narrative. So the deal was struck in March. John Carver had died the following month. And he's an impressive man in his own right. Influential, a visionary who would go on to welcome religious pilgrims and non-believers alike. He helped organize everything from finance to trade and legal codes to relationships. He would go on to hold this position as governor for most of the next 30 years. He was a man very much suited to work with Massasoit and the natives around him. And it was Bradford that decided to pay Massasoit a visit later that same summer. He wanted to continue good relations, but also he needed to get control of the constant flow of hungry natives that were visiting Plymouth since the treaty was made. They would stop by a lot, and they would eat a lot of food. Food the Pilgrims, quite frankly, didn't have. It also seemed prudent to begin to get a good lay of the land at this point. So in July of 1621, Edward Winslow and Stephen Hopkins set out for Samoset, 40 miles away. That's Massasoit's hometown. And their guide was Squanto. Massasoit had left him with the Pilgrims to help them learn the necessary life skills in their new homeland. He would serve the Pilgrims as a teacher, a guide, and an interpreter for the rest of his life. And in time, he would grow very dependent on the Pilgrims, as we'll see. So this trip was a smashing success in hindsight. Along the way, the Pilgrim ambassadors were received graciously by one group after another. Nobody was more gracious than their ultimate host, Massasoit himself, an almost smothering host by English standards. It drove them crazy. They gave him gifts that included a new red coat, which he liked very much, and a chain. And the chain, it was agreed, would be used as an identifier for quote-unquote special envoys sent by Massasoit to the Pilgrims. I mean, this is kind of a nifty way of deciding which hungry visitors the Pilgrims could dismiss and which ones they ought to entertain. It's pretty smart. This is a great example of finding a creative diplomatic solution to a potentially uncomfortable problem. For his part, Massasoit agreed to arrange for payment to the Nausets for the stolen corn the winter before. Weirdly, I'd say perhaps ignorant of the English meaning and intent, Massasoit claimed his loyalty and land to King James. I really don't think they were all on the same page there, but over the years, Massasoit would either intentionally or accidentally fulfill that pledge of loyalty to the English crown. Now, initially, not a lot changed in the carrying out of the treaty. But the precedent here was an invitation for the Pilgrims to invoke English judicial authority upon the natives in time of dispute. I think that was a really bold move on their part. Probably it's best that there was a little bit of a cultural and language barrier that may have concealed the depth of Massasoit's pledge. Or maybe he recognized almost prophetically what the future would hold, and he hedged his bets right then and there. Either way, this would ultimately become a problem. With good relations established, the only official hostilities toward the Pilgrims came from the Nausets, and that would change soon enough in kind of the feel-good story of the year category. It was a few weeks after this visit that a young boy from Plymouth, John Billington, became lost in the woods, and ended up with the Nausets. And Massasoit was the one who told the Pilgrims where the boy was. And the ensuing rescue party not only retrieved the boy, but managed to achieve peace with the Nausets. And the peace was secured by the Pilgrim pledge to replace the stolen corn. Massasoit had not taken care of that yet. But in hindsight, I think it probably went farther for trust and relations that the Pilgrims actually owned this debt outright. At any rate, this was the first real benefit of that treaty with Massasoit. He told them about the missing boy and where he was, and the Nausets actually received them well. So if you recall a few minutes ago, I said that there was officially they had peace. Unofficially, there were some, even among the Wampanoags, that were not happy. The Nauset peace agreement only intensified the displeasure of some of the other parties. The major impetus was the Narragansett tribe. They resented the budding alliance between the Pilgrims and Massasoit. Remember, these two nations, these tribes, were hostile to one another. The Narragansetts wanted to force the Wampanoags to pay them tribute. They wanted to dominate them, and the recent epidemics had definitely favored the Narragansetts. Remember, as one example, the entire Pawtuxet tribe had been completely wiped out. They were of the Wampanoags. So the agreement strengthened Massasoit. It also shielded Plymouth. So in a way, the Narragansetts might not have had a problem with the Pilgrims if it wasn't for this alliance. And I said earlier, they ultimately would be more than obliging to Roger Williams in Rhode Island. But they did have an ally or two within the Wampanoag Nation as well. Corbitant was the leader of a small tribe within the Federation, and he did not like the English. Now, I will say I did read some conflicting accounts. There was a couple that said he might have been a Narragansett, but overwhelmingly he does appear to have been a Wampanoag, but his village was in present-day Rhode Island, so he must have had quite a bit of interaction, I'm guessing, with the Narragansetts. He's probably close enough to be familiar with them before the English had arrived, I'm assuming. The treaty was made out of the long-term vision and need as perceived by Massasoit against several minor sachems, and Corbitant formed a plan with the Narragansetts to destroy the treaty. One good thing that happened from the scheme was that once the threat of the Narragansetts was realized, the Pilgrims re-engineered their fortifications. And it was Miles Standish himself that oversaw the building of a wall that was between 10 and 12 foot high all around the camp. And this wall was guarded around the clock. In short time, the following year actually, even these enhancements were going to be rebuilt. And I just want to give you an example of how the Pilgrims prepared. One account puts it this way. After the rebuild in the following June, it says, quote, "The fort is a large square house with a flat roof made of thick sawn planks, stayed with oak beams, upon the top of which they have 6 cannon, which shoot iron balls of 4 or 5 pounds, and command the surrounding country. The lower part they use for their church, where they preach on Sundays, and the usual holidays. They assemble by beat of drum, each with his musket or firelock, in front of the captain's door. Thus they are on their guard night and day." End quote. Now it goes on to say, this particular passage, "The fort was built on Burial Hill, within the limits of the town's palisades. The guns on its roof commanded the town and harbor. Although the colonists' ordnance in the early 17th century was directed primarily at European navies, it was effective also against Indian attacks overland. Artillery played a very minor role, however, in New England's Indian wars. It was most effective psychologically as a deterrent." Quote from one of the Pilgrims of the day, "The redoubling echo rattling in the rocks caused the Indians to betake themselves to flight, being a terrible unwanted sound to them." End quote. But it goes on, "In time, a communication system was established between the various settlements. The colonial government instituted a system of communal defense." Quote, "It is agreed that when an alarm is made and continued in Plymouth, Duxborough, or Marshfield, there shall 20 men sent from Plymouth, as many from Duxborough, and 10 from Marshfield, to relieve the place where the alarm is continued. And when any of these places stand in need of help, upon the continuance of the alarm, then a beacon to be fired, or else a great fire to be made from Plymouth upon the Galehouse Hill, on the Capitol Hill for Duxborough, and on a hill by Mr. John Thomas, his house, for Marshfield." End quote. I added that because that communal defense is the same kind of thing that was going on a night 150 years later when Paul Revere took his famous ride. The countryside was alerted that night because when one community was in trouble, they were all in trouble. And we see that policy began then in 1621, 1622 with the Pilgrims in response to the hostile natives around them. But meanwhile, back to the summer of 1621. Canonicus was the main Narragansett chief. He and his newfound friend, Corbitant, declared war on the Plymouth plantation. And together they set a plan to destroy both Massasoit and any natives that were friendly to the Pilgrims. The plan was for the Narragansetts to attack Massasoit, while at the same time Corbitant would kidnap the helpful natives that were living at Plymouth. I mean, there was Squanto, we already know him, and there were two other ones, though. Hobomok, who was actually a warrior and an advisor to Massasoit, whom Massasoit had basically given to the Pilgrims, and he remained a faithful friend and advisor for 20 years at Plymouth. And another Indian named Takamahaman. He's a man who lived at Plymouth for a short time, but was then basically lost to history. But the idea was to remove any assistance from the small English colony and leave them, quote, without an interpreter, end quote. Frankly, it would have devastated the colony. I mean, they needed someone to show them how to work the land, how to navigate the waterways, and to understand the various native tribes around them. Had this plan been successful, everything might have been lost. Corbitant did succeed in kidnapping the three natives of Plymouth, but Hobomok escaped, and he went straight back to Plymouth and he relayed the news. He told them that by that time, Massasoit was likely defeated and Squanto was dead. Well, Governor Bradford wasted no time in dispatching Miles Standish and a small contingent. Bradford knew that he had to respond. If he failed to act in accordance with the recent treaty, they may never again gain the trust of the local natives. He didn't know what had become of Massasoit, but he needed to retrieve his counselors first. The order that he gave was to either rescue Squanto and Takamahaman or to remove Corbitant's head and bring that back to Plymouth. I mean, that's a serious situation. It's a very serious response. It's a consequential response by the governor. Imagine if they had done this and Massasoit had been defeated. They would have been surrounded by hostiles. They'd have been dead. But Standish did manage to rescue the men, and Corbitant had fled, leaving behind 3 injured men. And those 3 injured men were taken to Plymouth, where they received medical attention. When you think about it, that's a stroke of genius on the diplomacy side. As Standish left the small village, he warned those that were left that any more trouble, and they would pay, whether that trouble was directed at Plymouth or at Massasoit. And as it turns out, Massasoit took care of his business as well, and the immediate threat was eliminated. In 1632, 11 years later, Canonicus and Massasoit, both still in firm command of their tribes, would again clash. As a result of their swift action, and in my opinion, maybe the mercy shown to the wounded, that had a very positive effect. It scared the aggressors. It changed their prerogative. In any event, an embarrassing defeat can have a real influence on someone's attitude, a very humbling influence. But the fallout to this was advantageous. As I said earlier, the Treaty of 1621 turned out to be a very advantageous thing for the English. Through this one event, this act of bravery, frankly, boldness on the part of the Pilgrims, many of the sachems congratulated the Pilgrims. And the peace that was established was strengthened because of the success of this rescue. And in addition, on September 13th, 1621, a couple of months later, Corbitant himself and several other smaller sachems working through Massasoit sought peace with the Pilgrims as well. So through this time, the Pilgrims had grown in stature and geography. The recognized Plymouth colony now stretched from the shore of the Narragansett Bay to the shore of the Massachusetts Bay. Thus, the political alliance was enlarged and strengthened between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoags. And it wouldn't be long, and the personal allegiance and friendship would be cemented through another act of kindness. And this one would be all on Plymouth. So there was a time about a year and a half later, after these events, after the kidnapping and the rescue, that the personal commitment went to a whole new level, a personal level. And I can only imagine as I work through this narrative. I mean, like any other event, we want to get the right mindset to really absorb the depth of what's about to happen in the course of our narrative. I can relate to this. I'll bet we all can. So here's the question before we look at the actual details of the event. What most endears you to somebody else? I mean, I guess that might depend on what kind of life you live or how you see the world. But for me, I admire greatness. I admire those who achieve excellence at their craft. I've found as I've gotten a little bit older that I can even admire those who compete against me because I can learn from them. I can appreciate the value of their skill sets. But I found, upon quiet reflection and considering my own life's path, that the single most endearing quality to me is fidelity. I mean, mercy and graciousness for the sake of mercy and graciousness. I mean, I've got some good friends that I know that are not capable of mercy and graciousness. They're still good friends of mine, but I know their character. And there are those that I might not be as close of friends with that I know have that ability for mercy and graciousness. And I so appreciate that in their personalities. When I've been the beneficiary of that kind of charity, I remember it. It takes a lot to spoil my affinity when I know somebody has extended charity, true charity, a charity that breeds a higher level of devotion or dedication. I mean, group support or professional assistance is great, but personal attention to my needs garners loyalty. When the Europeans arrived in North America, and the English in New England particularly, they brought a strong sense of who they were. They brought a strong conviction of what kind of society that they wanted to live in. They brought stuff. They brought finished goods, European stuff, things that they were used to, things that had value even in the eyes of the natives. One thing that they brought that's easy to dismiss, or frankly, not something that we might normally consider important, is medicine and a European approach to dealing with the sick or the infirmed. That approach was different than the natives, obviously. Different experiences bred different approaches, different medicines. In that same vein, the natives that were here had a social structure and order to things. We've talked about this. They had a social structure and an order to illness and how it was handled. The doctors, the shaman, played a key role in their societies. There was a close relationship in native culture between the shaman and the sachem, the healer and the chief. The healers were often advisors. They were men of renown. And they took healing seriously, the ability to heal other people. They lamented the sickness and the death of others. It was a sign of respect that upon hearing of someone suffering a serious illness unto death, that you visit them. And conversely, it would be rude not to acknowledge their illness. So as they learned about their new home and neighbors, many Englishmen learned the art of native healthcare. They acted as shaman in a way, with a European flavor. Men like John Smith in Jamestown, or Father Andrew White in Maryland, Roger Williams in Rhode Island, and Edward Winslow in Plymouth took the time to learn of the native ways and incorporated many of their European remedies into an almost shaman-like role within their respective regions with their new friends. I cannot help to think that there must have been some almost instant credibility for the Europeans among the natives. They came with new ideas and medicines, and they seemed almost immune to many of the diseases that so ravaged their own populations. I mean, they must have marveled at the idea of European medicine or European medicine men. Well, there came a time when Massasoit became ill, and he was dying, and word came to Plymouth. Now, Governor Bradford immediately dispatched Edward Winslow along with their trusted native friend, Hobomok. Squanto at this time was already dead. And we're going to pick up the tale of his life in another episode. But for right now, Squanto's passed from the scene and Hobomok is acting as the interpreter and the guide. Winslow had done a pretty good job of learning the language of the Wampanoags, which was similar to the other tribes in the region, as well as the geography. And he'd already played ambassador, if you remember. So it was that he was dispatched as the Plymouth representative to the dying Massasoit. And it was a 40-mile and several-day journey. And along the way, as they met people, there were rumors that Massasoit was already dead. And those turned out to be just that, rumors. So upon arrival, they found Massasoit was still alive. He was probably basically terminally ill at this point. He was going to die, but he was still alive. And they also found a swarm of activity, an absolute mob scene at his house. A lot of howling and wailing. There were women ministering to the failing Sakam's arms and legs. Winslow reported that the howling was quite unnerving. I mean, I picture myself either thinking, oh my God, shut up, or wanting to weep over the grief that was being expressed. Massasoit, for his part, had not eaten in days. He was weak and basically blind at this point. And when Winslow approached and Massasoit knew who it was, he said, and I'm going to paraphrase because the natives couldn't pronounce the letter L. So I'll say it as an English person, but just picture this without the L. Massasoit pulled him close and said, "Is it you, Winslow? And oh, Winslow, I shall never see you again." I think that's kind of dramatic in my book, but maybe he was really fearful. He thought he was going to die. People had come from all around. In true diplomatic fashion, Winslow said that he had come on behalf of Governor Bradford. But in true shaman fashion, Winslow went to work on the sick man. Now, this must have been quite a scene. I mean, picture the full house, the crowd of mourners, the shaman, the ministering women, the noise of the lament and the howls. The chief's jaw was clenched closed, his teeth held tightly together, not wanting to separate. But Winslow administered the first round of medicine, a concoction that he had brought with him, by the tip of his knife as he pried the man's mouth open just enough to get the ointment in. What a scene. Again, think about that. I mean, I'd be afraid I'd slip and cut the guy's cheek or something, you know? But again, this is one of those scenes I'd love to see Hollywood produce this. I think I'd be engrossed in the drama of this scene. Much to the amazement of the emotional crowd, Massasoit swallowed that medicine down. Everybody there knew that he had not swallowed anything in 2 days. I imagine an eruption of excitement. Upon further examination, Winslow found that a major issue affecting Massasoit was the bacteria buildup in the mouth. They call it FERD. I don't know if you're familiar with that term. Basically, it's that white coating that you can get from dry mouth or excessive alcohol or bad oral hygiene. I mean, it's fungus. Anyway, Massasoit had such a bad case of buildup that Winslow actually had to scrape and rinse his mouth. I know that you would have to perform this act for anyone with a furred mouth, but Winslow reported that the mouth was so furred that it had affected Massasoit's ability to swallow. On top of that, his tongue was swollen. All right, sorry, that's gross. I feel sorry for him, poor guy, but he's got nothing at this point on Dr. Pimple Popper right now. I mean, how did that smell? His mouth's just like loaded with this gook. How did it smell? It's like a big bag of pus on steroids or something. I don't know. The whole thing grosses me out. That was an act of kindness to do that. Remember I asked what can drive devotion? You know, an act of fidelity or mercy or graciousness? This was an act of all three. I mean, where were the shaman in all of this? Where were those administering women? Why didn't anybody else do this for him? The whole thing's just gross. So with the initial dose, Massasoit began to recover. Within the hour, even his eyesight made a quick comeback. Massasoit continued on the road to recovery, and Winslow worked very hard to make the medicine and to prepare the nutritious food that Massasoit needed to recover. He made him pottage. It's a kind of like soup mix, very thick stew made with vegetables and grains. And if you were wealthy or if you had them available, you would also mix meat or fish in with them in Europe. So anyways, Winslow makes this pottage to restore Massasoit's appetite and to get him to eat something nutritious. The last thing that he offered was a broth of corn flour and strawberry leaves and sassafras, strained. Now you remember, the Europeans used sassafras medicinally to the degree that one of the early voyages that we talked about probably a month ago now, one of those early voyages of exploration and trade was specifically in search of sassafras in the New World. Massasoit recovered fast. It was so fast, it was so complete, so it seemed, that Massasoit ate too much too quickly. He didn't just gorge himself. He ate until he puked. Think about that. Until he puked so hard that his nose bled. Then another round of, oh my gosh, he's dying ensued, because in the native culture, a nosebleed could be a symptom of impending death. But Massasoit didn't die. He slept a long time, but then he awoke refreshed. And with this, Massasoit requested Winslow tend to the other sick folks among them. So I don't know what was going on here, some type of, I don't know if it was a small plague or disease or what, but there's other sick folk in the village, which he did, repeating the mouth cleansing and rinsing ritual multiple times. Ugh. And of this, Winslow said, quote, "This pains I took with willingness, though it were much offensive to me, not being accustomed with such poisonous savors." End quote. I mean, leave it to an Englishman, right, to say it like that. It's gross. I don't think I would have taken that on with willingness. I don't know that he was in a position to say no, but that would not have been something I would have wanted to do. I imagine my gag reflex would have kicked in at about the second person and gained momentum as I went. Just yuck. But that's fidelity to a cause. That's mercy. That's graciousness. That had an endearing effect. The beauty of the immediate story then is twofold. First of all, they saved Massasoit, their chief benefactor's life. But also there were still many skeptics of the English among the natives. One of the visiting chiefs who had come to pay homage before the Pilgrims arrived had spread some doubt about their sincerity toward Massasoit. He asked where they were. He doubted that they would come because he was saying that they were not really friends and they couldn't be trusted and they didn't care about Massasoit. That might have been one reason why he was so dramatic when Winslow did come. Because the fact is, they did come. And they did more than anybody else to help the cause. So again, imagine the fidelity, the true affinity that this event must have planted in the heart of Massasoit, deep down. Some of our affinities in life, we can't even explain where they come from. He was saved. His people had been served. His friends vindicated. Everyone who was anyone in that region was either there or was being represented by somebody else. Everybody knew what Edward Winslow had done. And Massasoit pledged himself again to the Pilgrims. Now, needless to say, we've seen a lot this week. Not only how the politics played out over the Treaty of 1621, but how the personal bond was forged by a personal, intimate ministry to a very sick man. It's like the hearts of Massasoit and the whole Plymouth colony were knit together through this experience. And that's a good thing, because over the next several years, that bond would be tested, as we'll examine. But the immediate aftermath of this personal administration paid huge dividends for the Pilgrims. Massasoit pledged his loyalty again and made good on it in quick fashion. But that's the story for next time. And until then, I hope this week's episode has really helped the history to come alive.
Thanks for listening to History Comes Alive. We hope today's episode has given you valuable new information and inspired you to dive even deeper. Don't forget to check out Jeff's website, historywithjeff.com, and engage with Jeff across all your favorite social media platforms at History with Jeff. Join us next time as more history comes alive.